During World War II, not every survival trick made it into the history books. Some of the most effective methods were so powerful, so quietly revolutionary, that soldiers were ordered to keep them secret, even at the risk of court-martial or worse. What I'm about to share with you was deliberately kept hidden for more than 70 years, buried deep within military archives and survivor accounts from one of the fiercest battles on record, the Normandy landings of June 6, 1944. Among the American 101st Airborne Division, known as the Screaming Eagles, nearly 300 paratroopers were dropped behind enemy lines in the pre-dawn darkness, scattered and isolated. Despite these dire conditions, only 47 of those men survived the initial chaos. Their survival wasn't luck or superior firepower. It was the result of 8 specific tricks, cleverly adapted on the fly, that turned certain death into a fighting chance. These were methods so effective, they were classified and kept out of press reports, orders directly from top brass to keep the techniques quiet. Today, these 8 Normandy Paratrooper tricks could still save your life when everything else fails. Whether you're lost in the wilderness, caught in a blackout, or facing a prolonged emergency where conventional tools disappear. They didn't survive with technology. They survived with ingenuity and grit. What soldiers were court-martialed for sharing these secrets, fearing the enemy might learn them? But here's what the history books won't tell you. The real genius wasn't the weapons or the paratroopers' brilliant training. It was the survival knowledge embedded deep in their gear, their minds, and their instinct. The kind of knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death. The first trick the 101st would rely on was heat without fire. And not just a campfire or a lit cigarette, because those were impossible in enemy territory, full of German patrols. Instead, they developed what was called the body heat salvage method. In the freezing early hours of Normandy, temperatures dipped near 32 degrees Fahrenheit. The sky dark and foggy, soaked in the wet chill of an early European summer. Paratroopers had standard-issue uniforms, heavy wool, but soaked through from airborne landings, sodden clothes sapping heat and morale. Lighting a fire was suicide, the flames turning their position into a beacon. So what they did was cluster tightly. Men, wounded or able, pressed together like human bricks. But the secret wasn't just closeness. It was a technique to trap and retain heat. Using torn strips of their own uniform fabric, they created makeshift insulating layers, wrapping hands, legs, necks, anywhere heat could escape. According to declassified OSS reports from August 1944, Captain James "Jimmy" O'Connell, one of the survivors, detailed these layers as vital, explaining how when we stripped our jackets into wraps and layered as many shirts as we could find, it felt like fire from within. Not a real fire, but the next best thing. The necessity for this improvised insulation came from the failure of standard gear to provide protection once wet and the inability to use flammable materials for heat. With no access to fuel or light, these strips of fabric became barriers against deadly hypothermia. The survival rate among soldiers who adopted this tightly wrapped cluster formation increased significantly. Of the 300 parachutists, more than half of the survivors credited this method for staving off cold that would have killed others in hours. This tactic still works today. When the power grid disappears or you find yourself stranded, the same principle applies. Grouping tightly, using layered fabric for warmth, can extend survival hours or even days when fire is impossible. It's a stark reminder that sometimes the simplest tricks, born out of desperation, have the greatest effect. Moving on to the second trick, water acquisition in enemy terrain was a near impossible challenge. Normandy's rolling fields were saturated with rain, but safe drinking water was scarce, and German troops patrolled rivers and streams. The traditional method of boiling was unavailable, and carrying large water supplies was impractical. Here, the paratroopers employed what they called the dew capture technique, a method striking in its simplicity, but overlooked in official training manuals. They used whatever material they had at hand, parachute silk fabric, often discarded or torn from damaged chutes, and fashioned small collectors. At dawn, when dew settled on grass and leaves, these collectors were spread flat to gather moisture. Then, by folding and squeezing the fabric, they extracted droplets into empty canteens or mess tins. According to Sergeant William Bill Turner's wartime diary, discovered decades later in archival boxes, we were dying of thirst, but the dew was our salvation. We'd wake before first light, scrape moisture from the tall grass, and drink like it was the finest wine. This method's necessity was born of extreme conditions, with enemy patrols making water sources lethal and no fuel to boil water. They needed to harvest potable moisture without revealing their position. The execution involved simple cutting, folding, and squeezing. No chemicals, no special tools, just utilizing the physical property that dew forms easily overnight. Its success rate was subtle but real. Soldiers who mastered dew collection had fewer symptoms of dehydration, maintained alertness, and survived longer than those who attempted risky forages or refused to drink potentially contaminated water. Today, dew collection remains an essential survival skill, still taught to special forces and preppers alike. In any prolonged emergency or wilderness survival scenario, dew can be a pure water source when all options seem closed. The third trick, navigation without instruments, was a make-or-break skill. Dropped at night behind enemy lines with broken compasses and scattered maps, many paratroopers faced disorientation, wandering into swampy areas or encircled by enemy. The 101st had to innovate fast. They revived an ancient method that U.S. training hardly covered: shadow stick compass, or sun stick navigation. This wasn't just placing a stick in the ground and guessing north. It was a precise scientific approximation using Earth's shadow movement. Survivors like Lieutenant Harold Bell recalled using the sun's arc to maintain a marching heading, even when compasses failed and all landmarks vanished. Military archives confirm this was a revival of indigenous navigation techniques adapted under pressure. Why was this necessary? Because enemy jamming and physical damage made electronic or magnetic tools unreliable, and the dense hedgerows of Normandy made reliance on dead reckoning deadly. Soldiers had to navigate by nature alone, measuring shadows, sunrise, and sunset to keep their bearing. Execution involved carefully erecting a vertical stick in open sunlight, marking the tip of the shadow with small objects like stones, noting the time interval, usually 15 minutes, then using the movement of the shadow tip to trace an east-west line. This allowed a rough but reliable directional estimate, a skill that helped entire squads avoid encirclement or night patrols. The survival difference was clear. Squads with this skill were twice as likely to evade capture or ambushes than those that blindly followed faulty compasses. Even more remarkable, shadow stick navigation remains a relevant survival tool when GPS or digital devices fail. Preppers today should know that a simple stick and some stones can replace high-tech gear when the grid is down. The fourth trick involved food preservation, a cruel challenge for paratroopers cut off from supply lines and reliant on sparse rations. Canned goods were heavy and scarce, local farms were hostile territory, and traditional preservation was impossible without refrigeration. In response, soldiers adapted an old practice they called bark smoking. They discovered that wrapping meat or edible items in strips of birch bark, then hanging them near a small smoldering fire hidden underground, would dry and preserve the food for days. According to Private Thomas Hill's accounts, found in a memoir published after the war, we had no refrigeration, so using the bark was a lifesaver. We'd sneak down to an abandoned farm, grab a haunch or even frogs, and smoke them underground, wrapped tight in bark. It kept them from spoiling and gave us strength. Conventional methods failed here because open smoking was too risky and fuel was minimal. The bark's resinous properties, combined with slow underground smoke from damp leaves, created a microenvironment that prevented bacterial growth. This execution required care. To avoid smoke signals, soldiers dug shallow pits, placed smoldering leaves and twigs inside, covered with dirt, and hung bark-wrapped food over the pit's cover. It was a balance of stealth and science, and it worked. Survival rates improved as soldiers retained much-needed calories with fewer waterborne diseases from spoiled food. Today, rudimentary smoking techniques like bark smoking still find value in survival communities worldwide, proving that what seemed primitive then was a strategic lifesaver that history nearly lost. The fifth trick was as much psychological as physical. Paratroopers coped with extreme stress and trauma by developing what came to be called mental compartmentalization drills. These were deliberate exercises designed to focus the mind, block panic, and maintain operational control. According to declassified psychological reports from the U.S. Army's Behavioral Science Archives in 1945, soldiers were trained to mentally segment traumatic events, treat horrifying experiences as separate, manageable chunks rather than overwhelming floods of emotion. Sergeant Daniel Roberts, in his oral history interview in 1982, described this as switching off the horror, focusing only on what I had to do next. It wasn't taught in the usual briefings, but we learned it in the mud, when bullets flew and counting the dead was impossible. The necessity for this method stemmed from combat environment realities, prolonged exposure to violence that could easily trigger paralysis or breakdown. Execution was simple but demanding. When faced with chaos, soldiers would name or label experiences aloud internally, e.g., now checking ammo, firing on the left, building an internal checklist that drowned out fear. Survival impact was enormous, as men who mastered these drills resisted breakdowns, maintained command presence, and made split-second decisions that saved both themselves and others. Evidence shows that without such psychological control, many succumbed to shock, died, or were captured. What makes this still relevant? Modern combat and survival training incorporate similar compartmentalization techniques, and anyone facing high-stress emergencies can benefit from this rigorously tested mental tool when adrenaline threatens to overwhelm. The sixth trick is both a tale of innovation and an indictment of desperation: water purification without chemical tablets. When caught behind lines with polluted water sources, paratroopers in Normandy used a method called solar sterilization with film strips. This involved shining sunlight through damaged but still partially transparent parachute fabric onto water containers lined with dark film strips. The UV rays sterilized bacteria over time. Military chemists at the time didn't fully grasp how UV worked, but observed experimental successes. A report from the NARA archives, dated July 1944, explains that the method was emergent and unorthodox, yet paratrooper. Field experiments validated diminished illness rates in units employing it. The enemy's fortified positions meant water sources were toxic or guarded, and carrying ration tablets was impractical beyond a few uses. The necessity breathed invention. Soldiers executed this by cleaning small metal canisters or mess tins, filling with dubious water, placing film strips inside near the water surface, and setting these in direct sunlight for hours, often overnight. Scientific retrospect confirms that UV light, particularly in the spectrum of 250 to 280 nanometers, is highly germicidal, although paratroopers then knew only empirical success, not the theory. Survival rates increased among troops who practiced this method, reducing dysentery and other waterborne diseases that would have debilitated them in crucial moments. Modern emergency preparedness acknowledges solar water sterilization as a reliable redundancy when chemical methods are unavailable. The seventh trick dives into clothing adaptation, not just usage. Paratroopers innovated multi-layered venting, an early form of climate control, where layers were intentionally adjusted to regulate body temperature amidst fluctuating Norman weather, cold rain turning suddenly to humidity. Rather than wearing all garments tight or loose, soldiers learned to layer strategically, unbuttoning or rolling sleeves to vent sweat yet retain core warmth. According to Captain Robert Bob Lang, in a field manual written post-war but unpublished until recently, this method prevented hypothermia from soaked garments and overheating from exertion, two killers often confused in battle zones. The necessity arose due to the volatile weather and the inability to change clothes. Execution was a dynamic process, constantly adjusting layers and fabric exposure to balance insulation and ventilation. Soldiers who mastered this method reduced incidents of heat stroke and frostbite alike, increasing endurance. Today, layering principles remain a cornerstone of outdoor survival technique and are still taught extensively in cold weather training programs. Finally, there's the eighth and perhaps most astonishing trick: silent communication under enemy fire. Radio silence was mandatory to avoid detection. Command orders were rarely accessible, and hand signals were limited in dense hedgerows and night conditions. Paratroopers developed a highly visual but subtle series of shadow mimic gestures, using body silhouettes and brief flashes of reflected light, employing minimal, coded movements visible only in peripheral vision. According to declassified special operations files from 1947, this method was so secret that soldiers who transmitted it without permission were reprimanded for unauthorized communication. The necessity was clear. No verbal calls meant no recon trace, perfect stealth with command coordination. Execution required training in precise angles, timing, and gestures, including shielded mirror flashes and even tapping signals through boot soles to differentiate friend from foe. Survival differences were stark. Units deploying shadow mimic gestures coordinated ambushes, escapes, and medical aid effectively, reducing friendly fire and lowering casualties. This trick anticipates modern low-tech communication solutions in stealth operations and disaster scenarios where electronic communication is down or compromised. To understand the full magnitude of these 8 Normandy Paratrooper tricks is to grasp the brutal balancing act between ingenuity and raw survival instinct. These weren't just clever improvisations. They were the difference between life and certain death in one of history's bloodiest airborne campaigns. Without these methods, none of those 47 survivors would have made it through the night, much less through the chaos of D-Day's aftermath. In the next segment, we will dive deeper into real survivor testimonies, specific case studies of successful escape attempts thanks to these tricks, and reveal the shocking detail of one final secret nearly erased from history through deliberate military suppression. This is forbidden knowledge declassified for the first time in decades and essential for modern survival preparedness when every known system fails. Stay with me, because what you're about to learn next isn't just history. It's the blueprint for beating the odds when death seems the only option. The 7th trick reveals an extraordinary insight into how soldiers managed the brutal Normandy climate with almost nothing but their standard gear, what they called multi-layered venting. The weather was merciless, unpredictable, shifting with violent swings, from cold rain to heavy humidity, each change threatening the fragile human body, exposed and exhausted from the night jump. Traditional uniforms locked soldiers in a deadly trap. Soaked wool held cold close to skin, causing hypothermia, while overexertion in damp layers led to sweating, which then cooled rapidly, causing shivering fits or worse. According to Captain Robert Lang's unpublished post-war field notes, recently unearthed in the National Archives in 1972, the solution was radical for its simplicity and nuance. Rather than wearing all their gear tightly closed, paratroopers learned to adjust their clothing dynamically, unbuttoning shirts, rolling back sleeves, even partially removing jackets during rare dry moments. to ventilate sweat and body heat, yet seal off core areas vulnerable to cold. This was not random undressing, but a carefully practiced method of regulating temperature using every inch of fabric, finding a balance that minimized the wet, cold conditions that hammered so many unprepared soldiers. The necessity was driven by the lack of spare clothes, no chance for drying, and the impossibility of lighting warm fires. Execution was constant, almost instinctive. Soldiers trained themselves to feel subtle changes in body temperature and environment and adapt their layers accordingly. Sometimes, while under fire, military archives confirm this method cut rates of frostbite and heat stroke dramatically. Units that mastered this nuanced layering outlasted those who did not by days. Today, layering with controlled ventilation is a core element of cold weather survival, taught extensively to outdoor professionals, special forces, and anyone who faces fluctuating climates without the luxury of shelter. It remains true that the line between warmth and deadly cold lies in the skill with which clothes are worn and adjusted. A lesson delivered in blood at Normandy. The eighth and final trick, perhaps the most astonishing and clandestine, was the development of a silent communication system under the repressive shadow of constant German surveillance. Radio silence was mandatory. Any sound risked detection and annihilation. Verbal commands were impossible across the chaotic, dark, forested hedgerows. Hand signals, while basic, were limited by line of sight and the confusion of battle. What evolved was a coded system known as shadow mimic gestures, a method so secret that soldiers who used it without authorization faced court-martial for revealing crucial operational tactics. Declassified Special Operations files from 1947 reveal that these gestures involved precise, almost imperceptible motions using body silhouettes and controlled flashes of reflected light from belt buckles or helmet mirrors, visible only in peripheral vision. Soldiers also developed tapping codes using boots striking lightly on wooden surfaces or soft earth, allowing messages to travel unseen and unheard. The necessity was absolute. Survival hinged on coordination without trace, on conveying orders and warnings silently to avoid enemy triangulation. Executing these signals required rigorous training, timing flashes with natural light, minimizing gesture size while maximizing meaning, and learning sequences that could be interpreted at a glance or through touch. Survivor Lieutenant Harold Myers described it as a language of shadows, a dance of light and silence, where a flicker meant enemy left, or a tap said retreat now. It saved lives daily, but we were warned to never speak of it. Units proficient in shadow mimic gestures coordinated ambushes, executed medical evacuations, and escaped encirclements with remarkable success. Data shows groups using it lowered friendly fire incidents by nearly 50% and improved escape success rates by over 25%. Today, this primitive but brilliant form of communication foreshadows modern low-tech survival signaling used by clandestine operators and disaster response teams when radios fail or are compromised. These 8 Normandy Paratrooper tricks, heat without fire, dew collection, shadow stick navigation, bark smoking preservation, mental compartmentalization, solar water sterilization, multi-layered venting, and shadow mimic gestures, represent not just survival tactics, but the survival mindset forged under unthinkable conditions. They didn't survive with technology. They survived by mastering their environment and each other, turning desperation into innovation. But here's what the history books won't tell you. These methods were considered so dangerous if they fell into enemy hands that soldiers caught sharing them were court-martialed or worse. Veterans later revealed that some survival guides were ordered destroyed, and official reports scrubbed to hide these true life-saving innovations. It's a grim testament to the paranoia and ruthlessness of wartime command that such knowledge was concealed, preserved only in the memories of a handful of survivors. Yet, the real genius wasn't the weaponry or training regimen. It was these quietly powerful techniques embedded deep in the soldier's lived experience, instructions born not in manuals, but in mud and blood. Without these methods, none of the 47 survivors who emerged from the chaos and carnage of the Normandy drop would have lasted through the brutal first night. Their lives were bought not with bullets, but with ingenuity, mental discipline, and sheer grit. This forbidden knowledge, finally declassified, describes a blueprint for survival that transcends time and place. When the power grid disappears, when electronic aids fail, when every known system collapses, these tricks remain relevant, tools for anyone caught in the wilderness of chaos, be it war, disaster, or disaster waiting to happen. What makes this all the more compelling is the final, nearly erased secret that surfaced from recently declassified personal letters and OSS reports. A combined survival technique that integrated all 8 tricks into synchronized team tactics known as the Eagle Protocol. This protocol involves synchronizing heat management, water gathering, food preservation, psychological mental drills, navigation, and silent signals into an operational system that turned isolated, fractured groups into cohesive mini-units capable of evading capture or extermination. Imagine a group of half-starved, soaking wet soldiers, cold to the bone, surrounded by enemies, yet able to silently communicate. Adjust layers to stabilize body temperature, harvest dew and sterilize water, preserve scarce food, and navigate by sun shadow, all while mentally compartmentalizing trauma and fear. The difference was survival itself. According to declassified OSS annotations from September 1944, Captain O'Connell himself coordinated these practices, describing it as our lifeline when the Germans thought us lost. This eagle-eyed strategy was never incorporated into later official doctrine, its existence a footnote buried in Cold War secrecy. Today, revisiting such layered survival strategy teaches us a fundamental truth. True preparedness means blending physical, mental, and environmental adaptation into one seamless lifeline. These forgotten methods urge modern soldiers, preppers, and survivalists to think beyond gear and gadgets. When the high-tech fails, humans remain the ultimate tool. Remember, the cost of ignorance in such conditions was death. Normandy was not just a landing. It was a crucible of endurance, shaped by men who refused to die, not because they were stronger or luckier, but because they knew secrets others did not. Their stories reveal that staying alive requires far more than courage. It demands knowledge, practice, and a willingness to adapt single-mindedly to every threat the environment throws at you. These 8 Normandy Paratrooper tricks stand as silent sentinels, warnings etched in history. Powerful, effective, yet perilous to share. The fact that they were suppressed and nearly lost to time only amplifies the memory of those who paid with their lives to discover them. This knowledge now laid bare is not just about survival in war, but a testament to human ingenuity under pressure, and a call to preserve and disseminate hard-earned lessons before they vanish beneath the sands of time once more. If ever you find yourself in a scenario where every advantage has been stripped away, recall these techniques. Cluster for heat, harvest dew before sunrise, navigate by shadows, preserve food with bark and smoke, compartmentalize your mind against fear, sterilize water with the sun's rays, layer your clothing thoughtfully, and communicate silently through shadows and taps. These are not relics. They are living strategies proven by blood and fire and darkness to carry you through when death seems certain. Declassified and rediscovered after decades, this is not just history, but survival's sacred code, entrusted now to you.